Please.
Excellent. Before I forget, I figured we'd record it because there are some people who are interested in watching it in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Morgan. Yeah, so we will record this and make it available to you. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, this is just a quick 10-minute teaser that we're, really encouraging you to check us out, tidbits, but definitely register for our classes through Zoom. It does help us to track participation and see if you learned anything, see if you're going to change your behaviors, or keep in touch types of things. So we're happy to have you in any capacity, but we do appreciate y'all that have registered. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. We have quite a few people joining us today, so greetings and welcome to each and every one of you. We are basically starting off here as invasive species friend or foe. And again, just for those of you that just joined in, be sure that all of your questions go into the question and answer section. That's the most important part about our Zoom here.
So I guess we can go ahead and get started since we've covered all the basics. And Tina, if you want to kick it off.
Yeah, so I'm Tina McIntyre. I'm the Florida Friendly Landscaping Agent at the University of Florida IFAS, which is the UF IFAS extension in Seminole County. And we are located just north of Orlando. And I'm also joined by Dr. Pinkerton, Dr. Morgan Pinkerton. She's our Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Agent here at UF IFAS Extension. And this webinar today is brought to you by our Central Florida SISMA. We'll talk more about SISMA here in a second. So again, for all of you that are so eager to get those continuing educational units for your Florida Department of Ag license, we will be sending you a survey today, and it will be emailed to you after the webinar. So later this afternoon, as you're kind of getting through that after lunch slump, check your email, do the survey. It's just going to be a couple questions, nothing too extensive. And it's going to come from Qualtrics. So you're going to see from a no reply at qemail.com. So check your spam as well, as sometimes it does go to those folders. And fill out that survey. If you're getting CEUs or not, we really appreciate it. It's kind of your payment or ticket for the class. It really helps us improve our classes. We've been offering this class for a couple years now, and each year we get better thanks to those surveys. So please don't hesitate to take a couple minutes and fill that out. And this class will provide one continuing education units for natural areas, PCO lawn and ornamental, LCMLM license, LMLLO, OT, right of way, private ag, ag tree crop, ag row crop, forest pest, or aquatic. So you get one CEU in one of those categories. So again, this is brought to you by SISMA, which is the Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. And there's actually, this is a statewide organization, and it's alliance of stakeholders addressing invasive species management regionally within Florida. So plants do work very regionally, as we'll see here in our invasive species talk. And so these are regional groups of experts and professionals just like yourself that, master gardeners or land managers or, landscapers, and they're not limited by political boundary or property boundaries. And they work in that way just because that's how the plants work. And it's very collaborative. It's government, private organizations, so, for-profit corporations or businesses, nonprofit groups, for-profit groups, individuals, and others. Anybody who has an interest in invasive species. And so Morgan and I and Allegra are all part of our Central Florida SISMA, which makes up Orange County and Seminole counties. And then there's SISMAs all around the state. So I do encourage you to take a look at the map on the screen and see where your local SISMA is and see if you can get involved hosting various educational events or cleanup days, work days, things like that, or even just CEU days to have fun. And we really focus on prevention, early detection, and rapid response. And then again, education and awareness of invasive species issues. So today we're going to kind of talk about the who, what, when, where, and why of invasive species. There's some important terminology around invasive species that we're trying to kind of reel in, if you will. And so we'll talk about that. There's been a lot of terms over the years, and so we want to kind of define those, pull them in, and kind of say, okay, we want to use the terminology in these ways. So we're going to look at that. Pathways to introduction, so we can go back to that prevention and then, how eventually these things become invasive. The impacts of invasive species, prevention and management, case studies, a couple case studies of invasive species, and then resources for invasive species detection and management. And I know we talked about torpedo grass, so there's some resources there for you. So again, we do have a lot of terminologies surrounding the invasive species, and we're going to cover these in depth, a few of them. But I do want to kind of show you how extensive it can be when we're talking about various language. And especially if you're a professional or even somebody who's interested in invasive species, it's just important that we have a really good vernacular and terminology that helps us convey messaging to the public. And so if a species is native, it has that specific geographic area and historical relative aspects. Non-native might be from another geographical area, introduced, that it was brought here and to a new geographic area that could be intentionally or unintentionally. Established, so something that is self-sustaining and reproducing. And for plants and animals, there's a certain threshold at which they become more of a self-sustaining population. Both non-native and native species obviously can become established. Invasive, so a species that is non-native to a specific geographic area, was introduced by humans intentionally or unintentionally, and does or can cause environmental or economic harm to humans and that kind of a thing. A nuisance, so we could have a native plant that might be a nuisance, that is just like a nuisance species. It could apply to an invasive, it could apply to a native plant. And then the range of the plant and where we're finding the plant. And there's a lot of great herbaria around the state that voucher specimens and say this plant was collected at this time and this space and location. And so use them as a resource as well for any type of range information that you might need. So diving a little bit further into those really important terms that we need to make sure that we get right. So native species is a species that occurs naturally in a specific geographic area. In this instance, we're talking about Florida or maybe even a specific county. I just saw an article that was talking about specific species to our Florida Keys. And so those would be native to the Florida Keys, or even a step further would be endemic if it's only found in a certain area. And so if it's a species is native, it might also be endemic if it's not found anywhere else. So like our native scrub jays are considered endemic to Florida because they're nowhere else on the planet. Another example is our swamp sunflower. That's a native Florida species. And so when we're talking native, we want to add that geographical region that we're talking about. So it might be native to Seminole County or native to Florida. The Atlanta butterfly, of course, to regions of Florida, that's a native. And then, of course, our Florida panther. So non-native species is a species that does not occur naturally in a specific geographic area. And so oranges are a great example of that. You know, they're native to Asia, but we've grown them here commercially, and they've provided a lot of economic and traction for our economy and for our state. The air potato beetle, also a non-native species. So the air potato came, and then, as a biological control, we integrated this air potato beetle to be able to start to control that air potato invasive species. And so, it can be something that is basically just not from our geographic region. Again, pigs. Pigs are a great example. Pigs, could be some of our farm pigs, or it could be talking about our wild invasive hogs. So non-native doesn't necessarily mean bad. It just means that it's not native to this region. And then an invasive species. So this is something that is non-native, and it also causes economic or environmental harm to humans, or harms, humans. So air potato does harm our ecology. It harms our environmental aspects of our wilderness areas. It's a problem and for our homeowners associations and our shared communal spaces. When we think about the brown marmorated stink bug, obviously that's a problem for various aspects. And the Burmese python, which is, kind of obviously a problem for a lot of different aspects, not only environmental, but, with humans. So Morgan, did you have a comment on the
Yeah,
stink
I
bug?
was just going to say, and as we go along with the presentation today, we'll get more into detail in some of these as a case study and think a little bit more closely about the types of harm that they can potentially cause to our environment.
Yeah, that's a great point, because harm is pretty broad. And so it might be that it's specifically harmful ecologically, or specifically harmful agriculturally, or might be harmful to a lot of different aspects. And so the Burmese python, like I was saying, a problem ecologically. One of the studies showed that they're eating 90% of small mammals in the Everglades. That's a huge ecological impact. However, they also harm humans because, who wants a Burmese python in their backyard? So, people might not buy houses because of that reason, or, various other economic and social impacts. So kind of diving a little bit deeper into how the terms are related. So on the left-hand side, you can see native species in their native range, and they might be expanding or, kind of contracting that range on a natural basis based on climate patterns or, predator relationships, things like that. But that would be a native species in its native range. It's when that native species is taken out of its native geologic or geographic range and brought to a different part of the world where it's able to have some kind of outcome. That outcome could be beneficial. So that would be something like our oranges or our watermelons, or even some interior foliage that has brought, really economic value and joy, having a interior plant in your house, having a one in your office that's really nice, cleansing the air. So there might be a benefit economically to humans, to other animals, type of thing. So there can be something with no effect where it's just kind of a benign, not really harming, not really helping type of thing. And then we have invasive species which are causing damage. And again, they might have intentionally or unintentionally been brought here. So talking a little bit more about how they're brought here. Well, lots and lots of pathways. So, we have obviously ballast water for a lot of our aquatic or even oceanic invasive species like the lionfish. We have the ballast water where it transports various organisms. We have people dumping their fish tanks, and they say, oh, we just don't need this anymore. And we might get aquatic invasive species in that way. various types of, agriculture commodities going around the world. And, Morgan probably knows a lot more about the ag side of things.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways where invasive species can move. The biggest thing is sometimes invasive species are tasty, so they get moved throughout the world. And then we also have our hitchhikers, the ones that like to take a ride on, maybe it's the pallets carrying the agricultural commodities, or maybe they're on the plants or whatever we're bringing in too. So we live in a very globalized world now where things are moving all over. And unfortunately, we have to think about what kind of bad things can also be moving with a lot of the good things that are moving around too.
Yeah, and you might say, well, I don't run the port, or, I don't really do like large pallets of bananas and stuff, but we can all play a role because we're all transporting something at some point or another. And so even if you're going to a local nursery and buying some plants, inspecting those plants, making sure they don't have insects on them, trying to make sure that they're as best condition as they can. Even thinking about if you're taking the boat out on the weekend, checking your props, that you're not transporting any aquatics out of that lake to the next lake that you're going to, cleaning down your boat, in your car, checking your boots. This is how these things move from county to county and throughout our state.
And on top of that, some of our invasive species, they themselves can move. We're not just talking about plants today. Like, we have insects, we have our other arthropods and animals that can just get up and move on their own, or maybe even fly. So once they're in a new area, maybe on a new continent, for example, they can spread from there just kind of naturally.
Absolutely. So things like our pet owners, that pet amnesty day at zoos, make sure you take advantage of those so that you can, make sure that the pet gets transferred appropriately, so that we're not, we're being ethical to the organism, number one, but number two, making sure that the monitor lizard doesn't end up procreating in our wilderness areas, which is a serious thing for South Florida. So why is Florida at risk? Well, there's several little kind of parameters that does make it a hot spot. And so we're in the upper echelon of being a problematic area, and that is because where we are on the planet. So, latitudinally, we are at a very tropical, subtropical environment. And so that makes it that where we can start to see these organisms thrive and reproduce. There's no winter to speak of, really, that's going to freeze certain things out. And, then also that we have a lot of ports. We have a lot of things coming in and going, and imports and exports. So when you add a lot of those parameters together, we do see, this hotspot starting to develop.
Especially when we go back to talking about agricultural commodities, being where Florida is located, we get a lot of goods coming into Florida that then go transport by land to the rest of the country. So cut flowers, for example, a lot of times are coming from Central South America, some of our more tropical cut flowers, and then they stop in Florida before moving on to, say, New York or Georgia or somewhere else in the US. So
absolutely,
high traffic area, especially. And then another thing is we have a lot of tourism here too. So with tourism, there's more people, there's more goods coming in, and every person that flies on a plane could have who knows what in their luggage and carry on.
Yeah, and so, obviously everybody's well versed in COVID these days, and that's a prime example of how things can move about, even just on a viral level, all the way up to, something as big as a python. So the impact of invasive species. Let's just play a little quick game in the chat. Make sure y'all are out there listening. How much money do you think the US loses to invasive species every year? So this is not how much they spend mitigating, how much do we spend spraying or preventing? Billions, okay. Anybody want to take a stab at the number? Millions, 100 million, a lot, 5 billion. Yeah, so how much money are we losing in terms of invasive species impact? And that invasive species are destroying crops or doing other harmful things that we then have to fix. Billions, 50 billion. Okay,
I see a lot of good guesses out there, and this is kind of just an estimate, but the current statistics is that we're losing about $120 billion in the US alone. And so globally, there's even a lot more going on. So a lot of money is now being spent, whether it's mitigation or crop losses, and like Tina mentioned, all sorts of different negative impacts. And we can put kind of a dollar value on that to really open our eyes to why we should care about them.
Yeah, and another great example, you know, there's so much chatter about the housing market these days. And when we look at a piece of land that's for sale, if it's a beautiful kind of natively landscaped pine parcel, 1 acre, 5 acres, whatever, throughout the state, it's probably going to be more appetizing for somebody to buy that piece of property, as opposed to if it's filled with invasive species like melaleuca or camphor or golden rain tree, or, you know, just really difficult Brazilian pepper, other types of species that they're going to have to really take a challenge to get rid of and then develop the property or build a house. You know, with those pine trees, you could easily work with those pine trees to build a house, but it's very difficult once it becomes wall-to-wall Brazilian pepper for even just an individual person to think about tackling.
And I see someone put in the chat that loss of ecosystem services is priceless. There's some things we just can't put a dollar value on. So really there's more than just the money estimate of how much is being lost.
Yeah, like that panther might not be able to navigate through a really dense stand of Brazilian pepper. It's just not something it evolved to be able to get through. Maybe it can, but you know, that's something that dispersal, that as we have these really thick areas, they might not be able to get through.
So now we're going to kind of go into detail a little bit more about some of these different impacts and highlight some of the invasive species that maybe historically, currently, or in the near future can be impacting us here in Florida. And we're not just going to go over all the negative. Eventually, we're going to talk a little bit more about, why might someone argue that an invasive species might be a friend rather than a foe? So we'll start off with the foe and then kind of move into some more questions that we want you to think about when we talk about invasive species. So this is something that I definitely harp on as the sustainable ag agent here in Seminole County. Invasive species cause problems in producing agricultural and horticultural commodities. And one great example of that is citrus greening, which has severely impacted the state of Florida. So many of you might know that citrus has a huge history here in the state. It's one of our top commodities, and when you come into Florida, the first thing that people usually see is citrus, glasses of orange juice, and it's really big here in the state. But within the last, I would say 20 years, we've started to have a really big problem with this pathogen, which is an invasive species. So it's vectored by another invasive species called the Asian citrus psyllid. And what had happened here in Florida is we got the Asian citrus psyllid, and we knew it was an invasive species, but we had other psyllids affecting our citrus here, so we didn't really do anything about it. And so time went by and we had this, it was a pest that was just managed in citrus. And then all of a sudden, citrus greening was introduced. And that vector was already spread well throughout the state to pick up citrus greening and completely spread it throughout the state of Florida. So it's really problematic because there's no cure. We don't have a cure right now. There's been tons of money being dumped into research on citrus greening because of the problems it causes in production. It causes bitter and lopsided fruit, and that fruit doesn't taste good even when you juice it. So we have lowered yields, and then those trees die really quickly. So farmers are losing a lot of money and currently estimated at about $8.92 billion in just lost revenue. And that was just an estimation for a very short period from 2006 to 2011. And we've continued to see that trend throughout today's numbers with citrus as well. And along those lines with producing agriculture and horticulture commodities, purple nutsedge is another good one because this one's not just in the ag world. We see purple nutsedge being a problem throughout the world. And it's also in our landscapes, in our turf and ornamental settings, and it continues to be a problem for our agricultural producers too. It's thought to be native to the old world, but it's now causing problems throughout the world, and it's currently considered one of the top weeds in over 52 crops worldwide. So a lot of money is lost because this steals resources from our agricultural plants, it steals water, it can block the sun from our smaller plants, and then it competes basically with those plants that are there. Once it's in an area, it's very, very difficult to get rid of, and we don't have a whole lot of management strategies, especially for our organic producers. And then one of my favorites, I did a lot of research on this species and other stink bug species when I was in college, is the brown marmorated stink bug. This is another one that's native to Asia, and it was introduced into the United States, particularly in the Northeast, and has since started to spread. We actually detected it here in Florida for the first time in about 2019. And so now that it's here, there's not much we can do, and we've moved on to management. And it's a big problem in our fruit and vegetable production, causing this cat-facing damage that you see here. So what happens is when the fruit is really, really small, the stink bug feeds on it, and it has a straw-like mouth part that sucks out nutrients from that very specific area. And then as the fruit grows, it kind of grows around that area where the damage was. And if you've ever seen something like this in the grocery store, I know you probably haven't, because it usually gets picked out before it makes it to the store, because not many people want to buy this. On top of that, that damage makes the fruit rot a lot faster, and it makes the plant more susceptible to pathogens and other things that can go wrong in farming. So it's a really big issue, and this is one where I use this example because this was a hitchhiker. We think it probably traveled down in someone's car, on someone's camper, because in the winter, they like to go inside of warm spaces. So that's their overwintering behavior, that they go where it's warm. So it's a problem in people's houses. I remember one year I was up in Ohio, and on Thanksgiving dinner, we had a stink bug drop onto the table, just hanging out in the ceiling. So it's a nuisance in people's houses too, and not just a problem in agricultural commodities. With invasive species, we also think human and animal health hazards. So there's a lot of them out there that oftentimes reach the media, because when it's a human or animal health hazards, people talk about it, that's for sure. So Aedes mosquitoes are one of them that is of concern here in Florida and also in many other parts of the world. They think that Aedes aegypti is probably native to Africa, and Aedes albopictus is native to Asia. Two very, very prominent species that we think about when we talk about mosquito control, because they can vector some really, really nasty human pathogens. So some of them being like yellow fever, dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and there are definitely others. And in the Florida Keys, the budget is really, really high for mosquito control, and most of that mosquito control is going towards Aedes aegypti. So over $1 million every year. And it's crazy because only about 1% of the mosquito population down there is actually Aedes aegypti. But because of the risk of them to be able to spread these human pathogens, we spend a lot of money just for control of these species. And sometimes it might not be the species itself that's the biggest problem, but the fact that they vector things that can be a lot worse. And we saw that a little bit when we talked about the Asian citrus psyllid and citrus greening, in that it wasn't really a problem, just the Asian citrus psyllid, but once the disease or the pathogen got here and the disease was all over the state, that's when we noticed just how big of an issue it really was. And still talking about human and animal health hazards, some of you may be all too familiar with the giant African land snail. So especially those of you who are joining us from South Florida, you may have run into this as a problem within the last decade. The giant African land snail is something that was detected in Miami-Dade County not too long ago, and there was this huge eradication effort. So it is native to Africa, and it's thought to be brought to the US by someone introducing them as a pet, and then didn't want to keep it and tossed it outside. And all it takes is one snail to make a lot more snails. Each snail can lay thousands of eggs. On average, they produce about 1,200 eggs per snail. So that's a lot. All it takes is that one. It's a problem not only just being a human and animal health hazard because it can carry meningitis, but it eats absolutely everything. It needs calcium, so it eats stucco, paint off of houses. It also eats all of our agricultural commodities and ornamental commodities. Anything leafy and green it will find. So people's gardens were being ravaged by this snail. And a really cool thing to mention with this one is in the eradication program, they had hotlines where people could call if they saw one of these. And then they also had what we call detector dogs. So they trained dogs to be able to sniff out these snails and then go through neighborhoods and try to find them. Because part of the eradication was just finding them and destroying them. It wasn't like we could widespread apply something over the area to control the pest. We really had to locate it and identify it before control. And so eradication program was a really huge success in Miami, and they're waiting a certain period of time to declare it officially eradicated to make sure that no other hotspots pop up and they find it in small areas. And then we already brought this up, decreased biodiversity, when we were talking about you can't put a dollar on everything. And one of those is one of the species of plants that is really, really illuminated with is the air potato. And it can kind of just cover an area. So you can see in this picture here where air potato is just smothering everything that is there, the trees, the ground plants, just about everything is covered in air potato. And so it's smothering the plants, it's blocking them from getting light. And so that really decreased the biodiversity in this area because it's dominating the natural area. And they're very, very difficult to control because you can see these little bulbs. They reproduce really quickly and grow really fast. And so it's a difficult one, and it's not like we can just apply a bunch of pesticides over a large area because it's not just in people's backyards, it's in our natural areas and it's really widespread. But along that line, we have to talk about biological control, and this is something we mentioned already. Not all non-native species are bad. We actually have this air potato beetle, which someone went over to where air potato is native to and discovered this in China and saw, wow, it actually does a lot of damage and kind of keeps the air potato in check. And one important thing, it only feeds on air potato. It doesn't eat anything else. And that's a really important characteristic that we look for in a biological control agent. So we can introduce it to the area and help to control it because at this point, air potato is here and we've shifted to that management stage because we can't get rid of it and we have to try to just minimize the impacts that it's having. And it takes a long time for this kind of research. It took 10 years before they figured out the air potato beetle is good, it does its job, it doesn't feed on anything else. And so 10 years before we could introduce it here to the state of Florida and actually use it as a biological control agent. But alone, it won't control all of it. And Tina, you have something to add on air potato, it looks like.
Yeah, and so, we just have to make sure that it's not going to eat our crops or ornamentals or things that are providing that positive economic benefit. And one thing that I will add too is I know we start to get a lot of calls as soon as the air potatoes are breaking in the late spring and early summer that they're starting to vine out. And it does take the beetles a little bit longer to come. So there might be a little lag time, but give it, now is when we should start seeing those windows, those little, bug eating windows on the actual leaf structure. We still do recommend collecting the potatoes because the beetle does not do anything about those. It just simply provides a check for the constant vegetation growth. But yeah, if you're not seeing the beetles in another month or so, then that's when you might want to look at finding some from a neighbor's yard or finding some at a wilderness area and bringing them to your location. But it does take a little bit longer.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not just the beetles that are going to do the damage. And like Tina mentioned, careful removal of those tubers is really important. Hand removal of the vines, and there are some herbicides where you typically want to cut the vine and then apply the herbicide near the ground level to kind of get rid of it. There's a lot of work being done to continue, in addition to the work with the biological control agent, to find control methods for this.
Yeah, and just one of those disposal questions I'm seeing here in the chat is we do want to make sure that doesn't go into yard waste, that it is getting trash bagged and put into the trash, because these things, a lot of the invasive species just make one little fragment and then we're starting in a new area. So we don't want to be spreading that through our yard waste, trash and compost and mulching programs throughout the state.
Yeah, that's a great question too. We get that one a lot. And disruption of local ecosystems, we've kind of already talked about that in the plant realm, but we also have some non-plants, non-insects, other organisms that can cause problems in our local ecosystems. So one that people constantly are asking us about is the Cuban tree frog. This one, the reason why we get questions about it is because they like to get into people's sheds, they like to hang out on people's houses, and they're pretty sizable. So they can get up to 5.5 inches in size. So that's pretty big. Typically, if it's above 2.5 inches, it's non-native, and it's probably the Cuban tree frog. So that's kind of like a nice rule of thumb to think about with identification. The problems we see with it are that it preys on our native frogs and other small organisms too. And it can really outcompete in our little tadpole areas. It can outcompete the native tadpoles for resources. And I have heard reports of allergic reactions for when people touch them too. I myself have never experienced that, but there are some additional problems associated with the Cuban tree frog. And so we do recommend, unfortunately, when you do see them, to get rid of them. And at home, if I find them, we will usually just kind of put them to sleep in the freezer. And that's a good way to get rid of them as humanely as possible, because we don't want them causing these impacts to our local ecosystems. And then also, as the cover and advertisement of our class here today, we do have the Burmese Python that we're going to touch a little bit about here. They also can threaten endangered species when we talk about invasive species. And this is one of the big ones that's often in the news just because of how giant it is. The Burmese pythons can get up to 20 feet long. It's native to South and like Southeast Asia area, and it pretty much eats everything. We have even seen them try to eat an alligator. So it's not just small mammals that we're seeing, though they do a lot of damage on small mammal populations like mice and squirrels and rabbits, but seen them try to eat an alligator. Sometimes the alligators do fight back though. And then we've seen the Burmese python swallow an entire deer too. So unfortunately, in the Everglades area, there are no natural predators. And we kind of have the assumption that it was probably introduced due to pet trade. And so this is a common problem with some of our invasive species where people keep them as pets and they might escape, get outside, or maybe were released outside, which you're not supposed to do. Just throwing that out there for this reason, because it could end up becoming a major problem in the natural areas. And then shifting gears back to plants a little bit, we have some aquatics, and being that Florida is a very aquatic environment, we have lots of lakes, streams, natural springs, and stuff like that. In addition to being surrounded by water, we have a lot of waterways, both freshwater and saltwater. And there's the potential for those to be disrupted by invasive species. So whether it's a natural waterway or a public utility area, our water can be affected. And on top of that, a lot of our tourism here in the state of Florida relies on our water and our natural areas too. So the example we have here is Hydrilla, and this continues to be a major problem here in the state of Florida. It was likely introduced as an aquarium plant. So talking about that pet trade again, when people dump things that are in their pets' containers, or for example, aquariums, and dump them outside into natural waterways instead of properly disposing of them or getting rid of them, they can cause problems. So Hydrilla specifically, it's in a lot of our freshwater systems, and the stems themselves can grow 1 to 4 inches every day. So that's really, really quickly growing, and we can see how just a small chunk of Hydrilla can rapidly propagate and make a lot more Hydrilla. In our waterways, we are concerned about the reduction of oxygen level, and so that can lead to fish kills and things like that. And when there's so much of that Hydrilla in a waterway, it can actually start to clog up the waterway so that boats can't get through, clogging the motors like you can see in this picture here. But as we mentioned earlier in the class, what this means is when people move boats through these areas, they can potentially carry with them these plants, bringing them to a new location that might not have it already. So unfortunately, when it comes to Hydrilla, limited control, it's very, very hard to control. We have hand removal in small areas, and then for bigger areas, mechanical removal. There is some biological control, but there's not a lot on that front that's super effective because of how fast Hydrilla is really growing. And then we also have herbicides that we use for Hydrilla too.
Yeah, and just a quick note on Hydrilla is that it is also stimulated by our nutrients coming from our watersheds. And so if you're interested in that, I'll put in the chat. We have our fertilizer workshop on Monday, where we're talking about landscape fertilization. And when we do things on our land, everything ultimately affects our water. And so if we're having an invasive species that has the added bonus of feeding phosphorus and nitrogen that we're really supposed to be targeting to our fruit trees and our landscape beds and things, it actually makes it explosive. So where we see in urban areas, it starts to get even more of a problem. Yeah, so and kind of on that note, invasive species, obviously, and we did see on our Facebook when we were posting and promoting this webinar, is that obviously it's somewhat controversial, and we want to acknowledge that this topic is quite in depth. It's a lot of variation. We talk about insects, plants, mammals, herps, everything in between. And so when we're talking about something that's so broad and overarching, there can be a lot of confusion and a lot of variation that we're acknowledging that some of these species do have questionably maybe positive impacts. So especially in our natural areas, of course, they're typically going to be a negative. But when we're talking about a highly urbanized area, say a city like Orlando or Atlanta or Miami, when we have invasive species, they might actually be providing some good. And we do want to acknowledge that for example, this coral ardesia, it does provide food for wildlife. And so if we have it, kind of sprouting up in a fallow urban lot, it's providing food for that wildlife that are then spreading it possibly to a more natural and conserved area where it can become highly prolific, decrease our biodiversity, suppress native plants, and suspected toxic to livestock and pets. So, in this one instance, in this highly urban area, it might be providing a slight benefit, an ecological service, if you will. But then once it escapes and goes to our beautiful conservation lands and our picnic areas and our, our waterways and everything, that's when it starts to really become a problem. So we're going to look at a couple of these. And so it's very complicated. Like I said, some of these can actually be food. So looking at guava, which is an invasive species, this is a culturally important crop and food for a lot of people in our state. And it's delicious. So, if you've never tried guava, it's quite good. And there are some nuances there that this is the one invasive species, guava. And so, we're not talking about all guavas. There are some that are totally fine to grow. But in this instance with this species, it provides those things that it's sweet, it's tasty, it's tropical. There is commercial production in South Florida. But again, outside of that one little instance of, so-and-so's yard or, so-and-so's grove, it's escaping cultivation and it's disrupting our natural areas. It's serving as a host for invasive fruit flies, which then can go and predate our other crops, our peaches or our mangoes or, other sensitive type fruits. And so, we are looking at invasive species from a larger perspective, from a statewide perspective, from a county perspective, possibly. And so, with that in mind, the overall economic or environmental impact might be less, where in that one instance, it might actually be more. Here's another one. So our zebra mussels. So these can have positive ecosystem services where they're actually filtering the water and cleansing out toxins. And we see this also with hydrilla we talked about. So hydrilla obviously is a problem, where I can tell you myself, I've surveyed a lot of lakes and you put your prop in there and man, it just gets gummed up and you stop the boat, you got to lift up the prop, get it out of there and try to navigate through that waterway. It's a mess. But at the same time, submerged aquatic vegetation does help the water. It does clean the water, and so do these mussels. But again, when these mussels are so prolific or outside and in several ponds, where it can lead to a biomagnification of toxins when eaten by the predators. So if they're filtering out a large amount of certain pesticides or herbicides, and then it's eaten by, say, our raccoons or other types of animals, those are then bioaccumulating in large quantities. It's disrupting our local ecosystems. And so if we want our native oysters or other types of, clams and things to establish, these might be pushing those out or kind of serving a niche that they previously used to serve by our oysters and our clams. And they might outcompete native species ultimately. So it might be a threshold and a spectrum where you might see a little bit of zebra mussel, and then you might see other types of oysters and things like that, mussels maybe. But then eventually they might fully outcompete those native species, and we see an overall degradation of our biodiversity and our robustness of our native ecosystem. They could also cause damage to water treatment facilities. So, if they're actually growing up into that processing plant, then they're going to have to kind of clean it out where our native species might not be so aggressive in colonizing those areas. And then, reducing aquatic recreation, that they're actually, pervasive so much that it becomes a problem for that waterway. So again, we might have a small fraction that the ecosystem services are providing, but then in the larger context, as it becomes more pervasive and more invasive, then we see a addition of negative impacts. So here's, another example is our Monterey Pine. It might be endangered in another part of the world. So, this is an endangered species in California and Mexico. And it's an invasive species in Australia and New Zealand. So I could tell you, I know that our pond apple, which is seen throughout the Floridian Everglades, I don't know that it is endangered, but it's our native Florida pond apple species. from what I understand, is an invasive in Australia. And so, we might see something that's more rare, might be just really limited to the Everglades range, that is now prolific in another ecosystem. And so how do we are we looking at things that large and that globally? Or if we're looking at it here on a smaller scale, like the invasive Melaleuca is from Australia, case by case. So that's why it really is important for our SISMAs. As a SISMA, we work, within our little SISMA groups, so our Central Florida SISMA, and then statewide, we're working with other SISMA groups and the University of Florida and other university professionals to address these problems, because it really is case by case, species by species, could even be land parcel by land parcel. So ultimately, can the benefits outweigh the costs? And again, we're going to have to make that decision case by case, because some negative impacts is that we're having those economic losses to agriculture. We talked about the $120 billion loss per year. So that's a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of positive aspects to outweigh that. So human and animal health hazards, like we talked about, some toxicities to humans and pets, or maybe even livestock, the high cost of management relative to prevention. And that's really what today's all about, is that we do have a lot of established invasive species. We have our torpedo grass, we have our Brazilian pepper, our air potato, and our researchers are working diligently to create biocontrols for things that are not yet created. But prevention is where we can all make a difference. And so how can we plant things in our yard or cultivate things, in our neighborhood and our communities that are not going to be an invasive species? And I'm really excited to be working on a book with Dr. Pinkerton and some others to help people make that decision. Because there is a noxious weed list that says you cannot sell certain plant species. And so we're just talking plants in the book. But then there's also a lot of plants that are for sale, that are acknowledged as being invasives by our professionals and our FLEPC and our FISC and SISMA and such. So how can we avoid those plants that are still for sale, but going to be kind of available and out there for sale? And especially as our agriculture, our nurseries, how can we move away from growing those plants and provide more Florida friendly native plants that aren't going to have that high cost and help people be more preventative? Environmental damage, again, we do have environmental ecologists and environmental economists that do quantify ecosystem services and look at certain aspects of environmental damage that can be quantified monetarily. But then there's the aspects that we talked about that maybe not. Maybe some of it really is just intrinsic cultural heritage and value that's being eroded by these certain species, and disruption of our local system and our native species. Did you have something to add, Morgan?
Yeah, I was just going to say, really the key point and the key takeaway for this is, while there might be benefits in some small realms, the scope is just really small and very specific. So it's really a case-by-case basis, which is true for all of our non-native species. And really we see those negative impacts and the efforts we could put in to prevent them kind of being stronger than if we do let those species establish and what other impacts that they can have. And we are running a little close to time, so we will kind of like rapidly talk about some resources and revisit our kind of like invasive species spread here before we finish up for the day and answer all the questions we're getting.
That sounds good. Yeah, and so, here's kind of a nice outlay of how invasive species work, the invasive curve, we call it. And so, species obviously are not here, and then they somehow are introduced and they are brought here in some way or capacity, they arrive. And so we do try to eradicate those species, like Morgan talked about with the African snail and things like that we want to try to get on top of them before they spread in their range. if they become established and they, eradication gets away from us, we move to containment and we try to say, okay, well, let's just try to keep it in this county. Let's try to keep it from moving and jumping counties. Once it moves past that, it's really just protection, where we're managing that invasive species, with maybe herbicides, with maybe mechanical removal, with education, with other types of things. And so the prevention and, thinking about how we can reduce invasive species is so valuable. Thinking about what we're planting, what we're harboring as pets, what we're bringing in, obviously when you're traveling, things like that, to move to that prevention so that those species don't even make it to our borders. And then, they're less likely to get to that management stage, like our big category ones that everybody's familiar with.
And there are a lot of different people involved in this. As we've kind of reiterated throughout the presentation, that it's not just up to one person to stop the spread of invasive species. And that's partly because there is just so many potential invasive species. It's hard to keep track of them all, and there's limited resources. Though there are some government-sponsored programs, there's a lot of private businesses and organizations like SISMAs, like we talked about, that are working towards this effort of preventing the spread and movement of invasive species. Some notable ones are the Don't Pack a Pest program. So if you've ever come in to Florida, for example, having traveled to the Caribbean, you'll see these signs at the airports saying, don't pack fruit, don't pack plants when you're traveling between states. We also have our agricultural inspection stations. So any truck coming in, even also the boats coming in on ports and stuff like that, they have an inspection station where people are looking for insects, for plants, for potential problems that could be brought into Florida and the rest of the country. And so there's also monitoring programs out there through the state as well as the federal government to be on the lookout for invasive species. And then of course there's the educational promotion to get the public on board and aware of what's going on. And we talked about that protection stage, that management stage, and we really want to stress the importance of integrated pest management. We're not looking for a cure-all, but we're also not telling you that chemical control shouldn't be the what you're using. We're saying use these all as tools you have together. IPM is like a toolbox, and we might need a couple tools, and that'll make the most cost effective and the best control if we're integrating the different tools that we have. Some things to think about are what type of control strategy, how is it, what's the cost, both short-term and long-term? Is it actually doing its job controlling the pest, and what amount of time does it take in order to actually see those results? Who works on the invasive species issues? Well, like I already mentioned, it's a big team, a lot of different people. Here are some big names that we have working on invasive species, and some resources that you can always reach out to too. To kind of summarize that up, what can you do? That's the whole purpose of today, is to learn a little bit and also have that takeaway of what you can do to prevent the spread and help manage invasive species. Well, first, we talked about a lot of the different pathways. Don't be a part of that problem. Don't contribute to the movement of invasive species, and also keep an eye out. If something looks strange and unusual, if it's new, it might actually be. It could be a newly introduced invasive species, and you could be the one to report it and figure it out for the first time to find out that it's here in Florida. If you have something suspicious, you can always submit a sample, and we'll get back to the resources here in a second. And attend trainings like what you're doing today, learning about invasive species, whether it's identification or management. There's also a lot of opportunities to volunteer and attend more educational events to further your knowledge on invasive species. Some cool resources that are available to you is if you think you have a strange insect, you could always submit that sample to the UF Entomology Lab. Lyle Buss takes samples, and especially if it's an invasive, he'll get it to the right person to identify it and notify that it is a problem, it's been found here if it hasn't already. Same is true for plant pathogen samples at the UF Plant Diagnostic Center. Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, the Division of Plant Industry, is another great one. They also have a helpline for the reporting of invasive species. And then here's a few others that we have here, and you'll get all of these resources too. But I do want to make it to this last slide here, which is important. Your local extension office. And before anyone leaves, because I know I see a couple people saying they're headed out, for those of you for CEUs, we do have to really quickly do a poll to just make sure that you're here and paying attention. And then we have plenty of time to stick around and make sure we're answering those awesome questions that you guys had, and we can go back over the resources too. I just didn't want people to leave before we got in that last poll.
That's right. Thank you, Morgan. So we have the poll launch. We're about halfway done. Make sure you get your answer in there. We're just wrapping it up here. So it's, what is your level of knowledge on invasive species?
Now that you've attended this, this was a question we asked you when you registered, and hopefully we might have changed your level of knowledge a little bit.
I do see 5 people saying no knowledge. So I think they were sleeping or eating their lunch. We got distracted. That's okay. We'll have the recording for you all. And we're just closing in here. I need just under 80 people to continue replying so we can get everyone in. It looks like about most people are intermediate. And I would say this is a great overview, but there's so much to learn. If you're interested in plants or animals or insects or whatever it is, just, know that there's probably an invasive species out there that you can learn more about. And just another few seconds for the poll. So get your responses in before I end polling and we can wrap it up.
And I see some more questions coming in about that CEU requirement kind of thing. We're finishing up the poll here. So those of you participating in the chat, participating in the polls, that's giving us a heads up that you're here, you're paying attention. Hopefully you learned something and you didn't just set this up on your computer and walk away. So that's how we prove to FDACS that you were actually paying attention and that you deserve that CEU that you sat here for. The question of your license number, we will be sending out a survey afterwards. We appreciate everyone taking that survey because it really helps us understand if we're doing a good job teaching. But for those of you for the CEUs, it's extra important because there's a question on there asking for your license number. So that tells us, yes, you do in fact need the CEUs. It gives us your license number so that we can submit the CEUs. And then it also asks for your email address so that we can send you your certificate of completion for the CEUs afterwards.
Yes, and I ended the poll. So if you want to go ahead to the next slide, this is what your survey will look like. It's going to come from a no reply from our Qualtrics program. So definitely check all inboxes for something like a no reply, invasive species, something like that for all your inboxes, just to make sure you get it today. Don't wait, fill it out today, fill it out this weekend, and you will get your CEU, or, you'll just help us improve our class, help us improve our program. So regardless, we really appreciate you doing the survey.
Yeah, and we thank you all for joining us too. And we'll kind of sit back here again, because we do want to open it up for your questions and some more discussion on everything too. I see that someone also in the chat, I will mention, said they can't do the polls. No worries, some browsers, the poll doesn't quite work correctly, but if you're needing CEUs, as long as you put something in the chat or the Q&A, we know you're still here. Something to verify that you're communicating and paying attention, that's what matters.
Yeah, and I did see Mike William Price, you put your FDAC stuff. There's no need to put your licensure number in the chat. We're going to get that from you through the survey. And this webinar is not approved for FNGLA CEUs, just FDACs only. So we do have an FNGLA webinar this Monday that's approved for CEUs. It's our landscape fertilization. So I'll just go ahead and put that in the chat for you to register there to get those CEUs, and that is also FDACS approved as well. So definitely check that out. And Let me see, we can start to comb through for questions here. I see people are exiting, and that's totally fine because we're over time, but we're happy to hang out with y'all and just answer some questions here while we, just make sure.
Just some housekeeping stuff too, that I saw some questions in the chat and Q&A. We can send you a link to the recording afterwards. And that way you have the slides and information. And then I think there was another question that we might have had in regards to other trainings available on invasive species. I recommend that you follow us on Facebook because we post all of our trainings there. If we do have any kind of identification and management trainings, they will be posted on our Facebook. Our Eventbrite is also a really good resource, and we can send you that information in the follow-up email too, as well as the link to that fertilizer class that Ms. Tina mentioned. And
yes, in our October class,
yes.
So it's quite far away, but if you sign up now, you'll get notifications as we approach the date. So it doesn't hurt to just register. It's our October 26th at 8:30 class. It's the World of Invasive Species Insect Edition. So we'll have a lot of great guest speakers, and it'll be with CEUs for a few hours. So definitely join us for that one. It's open to professionals, master gardeners, and residents that have a particular interest in invasive species. So check that out.
Yeah, and that one might go a little bit more in depth on some of the species that we were talking about. And I'm an entomologist, so this time around we're doing an insect theme, but we're covering stuff that are forest pests, agricultural pests, landscaping pests. We're kind of touching on a lot of different types of insects in different realms. But there'll be more information soon on that, and we'll start advertising for it as soon as we get approval for the CEUs and know exactly what we can offer.
Yeah, and just be sure to comb that chat for some really good links. Allegra put there the air potato beetle link, and so you can check that out. And I did see a question in here about safely spraying your boat. So basically just posing it down is fine. You don't really need to spray anything in particular, but just making sure physically removing any pieces of vegetation from the boat will be adequate.
And another thing, I'm trying to comb the chat before we get over to the Q&A. If you do have any questions, please put those in the Q&A so we don't miss them. And one in the chat that I really wanted to get to, because it was in the chat and not the Q&A, is why are there not more federally sponsored programs for invasive species? There is. There are so many of them that most of us have never even heard of. And specifically, we've even applied for funds here in Seminole County to get more educational programs going on invasive species. And at the state level, that's also happening a lot too. Some of you might be familiar with the Florida First Detector program, which is one that kind of travels throughout the state, and that's federally sponsored there. But at a national level, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of federally funded groups that are specifically for detection and prevention of invasive species, whether it's trapping, for example, the USDA, as well as the Florida Department of Ag. They have people trapping constantly throughout the country for some of our big name invasives that we're worried about here, especially those that could affect our agriculture and, of course, some that affect natural resources. There's also groups within the federal government that their sole job is to do risk assessment. So there's species that haven't been introduced yet, and we have to do a risk assessment for every country we trade with to make sure that there's not the potential that that specific species is being brought in and what kind of risk could be associated with that species arriving. So I don't want you to think there's not a lot of the behind the scenes going on, because there is so much money getting dumped into these programs to help prevent and stop the spread, as well as manage those that already exist. And a similar question that I think we had in the chat is, it may have been answered already, but I'll kind of go over it. Someone asked if maybe we've gotten better at invasive species management. I don't know if we've gotten better, if we just started to communicate a little bit better. Because we're still, to some degree, using a lot of the same strategies to manage invasive species, and more research is coming out that I think people are finally starting to talk. And that talking is really helping to facilitate the strategies that we are using for invasive species management.
Yeah, and I did see somebody's looking for a field guide or some kind of identification assistance. And I would definitely check out the UFIFAS bookstore for the invasive and non-native species resources. They have some really cool field guides. This is a little flip books. They have books, they have posters and all kinds of things. So a really great resource. That is where our publication will be for sale once we finish it. And so definitely check that out for those resources. In terms of removal, I'm seeing a question about Kogan grass and Johnson's grass or barnyard grass. Any of these types are really pesky grasses. Definitely would recommend the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Species or Plants, CAIP.
Let me go back to.
And that's going to have removal recommendations, and they go through mechanical, chemical, all the different aspects for that species, because it's not always the same, right? There's different types of pesticides and different types of maybe treatments, mechanical or otherwise, that might be more beneficial for that species over other species. It's not a one size fits all for removal.
And actually, I'll go ahead and stop sharing so we can start answering some of these questions. I know we got a ton of them coming in. One of the ones on here, citrus greening, this was asked pretty early on. We know that poor phytosanitary practices help spread citrus canker, but is this the same for citrus greening? It's just kind of good practice in general to have good phytosanitary practices, because it may not be spreading something invasive, but it could potentially be spreading all sorts of other things between farms, especially. With citrus greening, it's kind of one of those things where the vector is so far spread throughout the state here that the good phytosanitary practices aren't going to do that much to help. One of the reasons being is because there's a lot of abandoned citrus groves now that are just harboring citrus greening. And so the vector flies into the abandoned grove and then jumps over to a commercially operated and managed grove and spreads the pathogen. So some of the strategies right now for control of citrus greening are exclusion of that vector, as well as just making sure the plant is happy and healthy to begin with, because while phytosanitary practices are very important, the bigger issue with citrus greening is really that vector is out there and ready to move the pathogen around. So I think that covers a lot of that, but if you have more questions on that, I could go on and on for days about citrus greening.
Yeah, and so I'm seeing here a question about the recording. So we will send you one email on the survey and then a separate email with some links and a PowerPoint of the slides, or sorry, the PDF of the slides. And a recording we'll probably make available on our YouTube later. And so just keep an eye out for that. At the very least, you'll definitely have the slides as a resource. And then probably maybe two more questions, Morgan, just to wrap it up. Why isn't hanging moss controlled more, as it seems to harm leaves and stems? So that's a really fun landscape question. You know, the term nuisance is what we talked about, and nuisance might be one of those terms that's really relative. And so I might find something to be a nuisance where Morgan might really like it, or might welcome it, or might not really care about it, you know? So it's really subjective in the eye of the beholder type of a thing. With our native Spanish moss, it's actually in the bromeliad family, so the pineapple family. And it's not invasive, it's not harmful. It might be considered a nuisance because it can proliferate in the landscape. However, it's not going to hurt your trees in any way. The problem is what we see a proliferation of the Spanish moss. We try to look for other things going on. So you might see, you might need a soil test. You might need to look for other issues, over irrigation or things like that, that the tree is naturally starting to decline. and the Spanish moss is now moving in as an opportunity to grow. And so, you might want to think about the tree that it's growing on and how can we healthily and robustly support that organism, and so that it can flourish. So it's not necessarily the moss, it might just be like really checking the tree to see if there's a way that we can nourish that. Maybe with fertilizer, maybe a soil test, maybe irrigation regimen, things like that. So something to consider.
Ooh, and I see a really good question in here. Are there any residential behaviors you can think of that people do in and around their home to contribute to invasive species problems without even realizing that? That's a wonderful question, Chelsea. So yes, there are a lot of behaviors. One of them we did touch a little bit on is planting things that they probably shouldn't be, or propagating invasive species and planting them in their yard. That's a really big problem. And one of the, as Tina mentioned, the ID books that we're kind of working on right now is a don't plant this, plant something else instead. Even though it's not any federal restrictions on planting these types of plants, they aren't the best to be planting in your yard because of what happens when they escape cultivation, or they can even really become a problem when they start to kind of take over the area you planted them in too. On top of, you can continue with that. I was going to get into some ag stuff, but do you have anything else to add, Tina?
Yeah, just right plant, right place, and selecting your native plants, your Florida friendly plants, and avoiding plants that might be questionable, that might be kind of taking over your neighbor's yard. And you might say, oh, well, it's pretty and it'll, cover my ground cover, but it's going to kind of keep making its way and causing harm and eventually make its way to our natural areas. So that, and definitely not dumping your fish tanks, not dumping your pets. That's a big one. People think, oh, well, it's just one fish tank. But if everybody, or even just two people do that, or maybe if the fish was pregnant and just that one can actually spawn a population. And so, we want to be thinking about these types of actions.
And I also think about seeds. I wonder how many of you remember when there were the seeds coming by mail and people weren't really sure what were in these seed packets. And there was a lot of news stories going on about that. When people share seeds, especially if they're not seeds, they know what's in them, they could be moving seeds of invasive plants. Or there could be pests and pathogens mixed in with those seeds that we could plant them and then have that spread to our native species, as well as be a problem in our agricultural commodities. So it's hard to regulate with all this online sale of stuff, the movement of some of these species, especially when it comes to moving seeds and plants, because they can easily be packaged in something small and sent kind of undetectably through the mail. And even beyond just that, people can put anything in a package. So if someone's shipping oranges from Florida all the way to California, that's really, really bad because that could potentially be sending citrus green over there. And though you're not supposed to put that kind of stuff in packaging, and sometimes people innocently think, well, my family's out there and they really want something from home. It could be moving those invasive species. And we do have some severe weather going on, so we might get disconnected here. Sometimes our power does go out if you can't hear the thunder in the background. Yeah, there's a lot of different things that residents could potentially do to spread those invasive species. And by attending trainings like this, you're learning little by little what you should think about and what you should be aware of.
Yeah, great job, everyone, today joining us and learning more, thinking about ways that you can do better for our environment, for our economy, for our society. And, join us at a future webinar to learn more about, pro agriculture and pro environmental type webinars that we're always offering here at Extension. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Pinkerton, for all your help today. Thank you, behind the scenes, Allegra.
And one more thing I want to mention, I did see a question on proper use of herbicides. As Tina mentioned, we have lots of cool classes here in Seminole County, and some of those are pesticide trainings. So we didn't really touch too much on pesticides today, but you can always reach out to us for classes on that because we offer them pretty regularly.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank
I
you,
think-
everyone. We'll
think
see you
that's
next
it.
time. Check out our, we also have our fruit tree webinar next Tuesday. Get your grove on, and our Facebook page has tons of information. So we'll see y'all later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.